else. It would not take a great campaign for you to share the gospel of Jesus Christ if you truly understood the magnitude and the power of this thing called the gospel. And so we've gotten so consumed with issues that we have moved to this space where we no longer talk about the gospel. And so we want to spend more time defending our ideologies and our traditions and our positions than we do wanting to share the core and central message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me tell you something. Your position, whether it be liberal or whether it be conservative, has never saved anybody. It's the gospel and the gospel alone that is about the salvation of souls. Hello, somebody. I need somebody that understands what I'm talking about. And so somehow the devil has deceived us into believing that we have a responsibility to dig our heels in and defend our ideologies, our positions, and our traditions. And so what that has done is it has shifted us away. It has shifted us away from sharing the one thing that actually impacts the lives of men and women, boys and girls all over this earth. And that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I understand that you might want to step to somebody and debate them as to why your church doesn't use instruments of music. But guess what? That message has never saved anybody. That message has never saved it. Y'all can kick me out of here if you want to. But that message has never saved anybody. Jesus Christ didn't go up on the cross to defend your position to sing a cappella music. That's not why Jesus Christ went to the cross. So I'm not saying that there's not a place for that discussion, but what I'm saying is that ain't gonna save nobody. And so if you are so intent on digging your heels in and defending your position, then all you're doing is engaging in arguments and you're not sharing the gospel. And then you wonder why the church looks the way that it does. There are churches that you can go in right now this morning, you can open up the doors, and you can shoot a cannonball through there and not hit a soul. You want me to name names? I can name you some places that you can go right now. And you sit down on the pew and nothing but dust comes up because nobody has sat in it. And God knows how long. Because we've been so consumed with our traditions, our positions, and our ideologies that we've forgotten that we've been commissioned to share one message. And that's the message about the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is the message. That's what it's all about. That's why I gravitated toward this particular text in Romans chapter number 1. I told you several weeks ago when we preached on Romans chapter number 12, I believe it was, that we are in this book of Romans where it is often regarded as the fifth gospel. It is because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they deal with the life and the times of Jesus, the activity of Jesus. But when we get to Romans, it deals with the purpose of Jesus. And the central message of the book of Romans is still the gospel. And so he goes through his normal pleasantries and greetings and salutations. Then he talks about how he desires to come to them. How he desires to come to them and to share with them the gospel, but also how he's hoping that somehow that their interaction that their mutual faith can strengthen each other. And then he gets down to this point in verse number 16 where he uses this very familiar passage of scripture that may have been your memory verse as a child, where it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, for the just shall live by faith." Y'all with me this morning? And so I just want to talk to you this morning about the paradox of power. The paradox of power. Paul here says that he is not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. I read somewhere that Jesus, for the joy set before him, despised the shame and endured the cross. It's because of what Jesus saw as the thing that was set before him, the thing that would be accomplished, that the shame that came along with the cross was worth it. The shame that came along with the cross was worth enduring because what he was going to accomplish in giving his life at Calvary was a much bigger thing. It was a much bigger thing than the shame that he would endure. So Paul also has been a person that has endured a lot of shame for the sake of the gospel. He went some places and he was laughed at. He went other places and he was chased out of town. He went other places and he was ridiculed. When he was in Corinth, his sharing of the gospel was considered foolishness to some. Y'all understand where I'm coming from? So that Paul was going from place to place, essentially making a fool of himself for the sake of the gospel, but it was all worth it. It was all worth it. He saw that what could be accomplished through the gospel was worth the possibility of even making a fool of himself. It was worth the possibility of being kicked out of the in crowd. It was worth the possibility of being ridiculed by friends. It was worth the possibility because he understood what could be accomplished through the gospel. Yeah. So my question to us is, when was the last time that we noticed the magnitude and the power of the gospel enough that we were willing to put ourselves in a position that was uncomfortable for the gospel's sake? When was the last time that you were willing to share the gospel with somebody even though you didn't know how it would be received? When was the last time that you shared the gospel with somebody understanding that it might change the tenor of that relationship? But you have to see the gospel as being so powerful and so paramount that no matter how it might be received, and no matter what the outcome might be for you personally, that you still have an obligation to share it with somebody. You see, when you have allowed the power of the gospel to work in your life, you don't care what anybody thinks about you. So when you have had the power of the gospel at work in your life, and you understand that the gospel, he says, is God's power for or unto salvation. And so when you understand that the death, the burial, and the resurrection is a vehicle that God uses to pull you up out of your situation, then you begin to share that message with somebody else. So don't believe that it is because you worship in this place. Don't believe that it's because you're in the place that sings a cappella music. Don't believe that it's because of your own goodness and the things that you do, and because you're here on Wednesday, and because you're here on Sunday. It's not because of anything that you do. Gospel is God's power. The gospel is God's power to save. It ain't about you. The gospel is the thing that God uses to save. The gospel is the thing that allows you to change. The gospel is the thing that pulls you up out of your situation. The gospel is the thing that changes your right now as well as your tomorrow. The gospel is that thing. But if you, first of all, didn't respond to the gospel, then you have a problem. Right. Okay. Y'all got quiet. Because maybe you didn't respond to the gospel. Maybe you responded to a type of gospel. I believe it's in the book of Galatians that the same Apostle Paul says that he's confused about how these people had so quickly accepted another gospel. You understand where I'm coming from? Sometimes we get ourselves caught up in another gospel. You see, the thing is that the other gospel is not able to save. So you have to know what it is that you are responding to. Because you can respond to something that is a gospel, but is not the gospel. So you're walking around doing things to maintain your salvation in a gospel, but you're not doing what you need to accept salvation according to the gospel. That's why I'm talking to you about the idea of sitting here and defending positions, traditions, and ideologies, because that is a gospel, but it is not the gospel. Y'all all right? It says that the gospel is God's power for salvation. The gospel is God's power for salvation. Just say that to yourself for a second. The gospel is God's power for salvation. The gospel is God's power for salvation. The gospel is the thing that God uses to save. So why would we allow ourselves to spend our time and our energy sharing anything but the thing that can save folk? It just doesn't make sense. But see, the paradox of power is this, is that the cross crucifixion, everything that Jesus went through, was regarded by many as something that was weak or shameful. So God uses the thing that is weak and shameful to show forth his power. That's confusing to some people because you expect power to come in a particular way and from a particular disposition. But God used Jesus in a humble way to show forth his power. So he took this position that was considered weak. He took this position. If he exercised this from a form of piety, if he used some methodology that would have been honorable, then it would have only been relatable by people that were in the upper echelon. Does this make sense? So he had to use something that was so lowly that no matter where you fall on the spectrum of society, you can understand that this is still something that you need too. For the gospel, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So look at what it does. So he's not ashamed of this powerful thing, this paradox of power. He says, it's for everybody who believes. Watch this. Because the gospel, this lowly thing that God did to show forth his power, is a great equalizer. Because here's the thing. No matter where you fall on the spectrum of intellect or society, you still have a soul that needs saving. You can't buy your way into heaven. You can't intellectually discuss your way into heaven. You cannot hang enough degrees on the wall to get you to heaven. Y'all understand where I'm coming from? But at the same time, you can't be broke enough not to get to heaven. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't have anything to do with your status. The gospel is a great equalizer. Why? Because everybody has a soul that needs saving. Y'all understand how this works? So yes, it might have first been delivered to the Jews because it came out of Old Testament theology, right? But the gospel, what Jesus Christ did, was the great equalizer. Y'all with me so far? It was a great equalizer. It says it's available to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So this concept of belief then runs through the entirety of this text. Now watch this. Now this is called the propitio, or the proposition, or the thesis statement of this entire book. This entire book is about this thing that God did through the gospel. He is not ashamed of this powerful thing called the gospel, because even though it might be shameful to other people, it's a lowly thing that God used to show forth his power. Why? Because it is a great equalizer to everybody who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Right? You don't have the right to decide who receives the gospel. You don't have the right to just invite your black co-workers to church. You don't have the right to... Come on now, y'all. You don't have the right to decide who receives the gospel. Y'all understand where I'm coming from? We don't live in such a segregated society that you don't interact with people that don't look like you. But if you believe that just because you go to a predominantly black church, that you only have a predominantly black mission, then you're misunderstanding what God has called you to do in this place. I appreciate the tradition of the African American church. I absolutely do. But the reality is that, you know what, there are still some people that may not look like us that can come in and respect and appreciate the tradition of the African American church as well. So just because they don't look like us, don't think that they won't come in here, wave their hand and shout hallelujah just like you. The gospel is an equalizer, which means that you also don't get to choose who you share it with. Does that make sense? There's no reason with the number of people, because look at this. If every person in here shared the gospel with one other person, we wouldn't have enough seats for this building. But you have gotten so comfortable responding to a gospel opposed to responding to the gospel. That we can just sit up in here